Everybody's paying so much attention, you're all resting, ready to go home, I'm sure. So enjoy your rest. I'll try and just take 10, 15 minutes of your time. So really quick to introduce myself. My name is Vaughn Eisler and I work at a company called Equinix. How many of you ever heard of Equinix? I bet very few of any. Oh, one, thank you. So most of you haven't heard of Equinix, so I'll maybe make a little bit of an introduction of who we are, why we're here, and then I'm going to kind of dive in and spend obviously a majority of my time talking a little bit about security and as content creators and as content distributors, what are the types of things we should be thinking about from a security perspective as we go through kind of a typical CDM workflow in the cloud. So as a quick introduction to Equinix, we're actually known as a data center company. So what that actually means is companies like a Netflix maybe might come and host their content service, buy space and power from us, stand up their application, whatever that application might be, and then deliver that over the internet or however they're going to deliver it. So when I actually just joined from a cybersecurity company a couple years ago, I had never heard of the company either, but it's really focused on space and power and companies hosting their applications in a neutral location where they might not want to put them in Amazon or Azure today. And as all these kind of statistics show, it's globally available, global platform in over 52 metro areas and 200 data centers worldwide. But the real value prop is not in you hosting your application or service like the Netflix in our data center, it's really about the interconnectivity that fosters. And so what is interconnectivity? Something I'd also never heard of a couple of years ago before joining. So this slide sort of attempts to articulate that idea. So if you could think back 20 years ago, which is probably hard for all of us, internet services were pretty new and prevalent. You might have bought your internet service from AT&T, somebody else might have bought it from Verizon, but you needed to connect those two services somehow together. So AT&T and Verizon, as internet service providers, needed a way to connect to each other. And they did that at a neutral location where they privately connected through fiber to each other. And then think of content, why we're all here at this show for some reason. Going back to Netflix, right? All of us as consumers want to consume that service, whether it's Hulu or Netflix or whatever, in the best user experience possible, which means no jitter, no latency, no pauses. And so Netflix, as a service provider of content, wants to get their content closer to you and I as the closest to you and I as the consumer as possible. So they decide to put their content in a facility like ours because we can interconnect them to the consumer. Think financial services. All of us shop at a retail store like Target every day. We swipe our credit card. And of course, what we see is approved or not approved within about a second. Behind the scenes, what's really going on is that credit card transaction is going through a bank processor. It's going through a credit card wholesaler like Visa Network, another bank processor, and so on. There's 5, 6, 7 players in that value chain that need to look at that transaction, make sure it's okay. And that happens in a very latency sensitive, high performance fashion. And so what happens is banks, credit card companies, wholesalers all connect to each other over private interconnections, fiber, directly talking to each other to allow that kind of financial services transaction. And so that happens now with cloud, right? Amazon, you can connect to Amazon directly through their Direct Connect offering, and then enterprises want to start connecting to that. So Equinix as a company is all about data centers and then using those data centers as a way to connect these different ecosystems of players together. So why would I be up here talking to you about that in cloud? And the answer from a security perspective is piracy, right? So I don't know how many of you would have heard of some of these different sort of considerations, but piracy is obviously a big concern within our industry today. So if you haven't heard of some of these kinds of examples, I think about 2-3 years ago, Game of Thrones, HBO was hacked, Game of Thrones video content was sent out on the internet, available to anybody, and several scripts were taken. You may have heard, I think it was 2014 or 2015, Sony Entertainment got hacked, presumably by the North Korean government, supposedly, and that was because they were about to release that movie about the dictator, and they didn't want that to happen. Recently, a French television station got hacked and 12 of their channels got taken down for about 12 hours. Gaming networks. I mean, I could throw up example after example of piracy becoming a problem, and that problem having a very specific brand and monetary impact to the world at large. So if you're looking at the right-hand side of this slide, you can believe statistics to a certain level, but 52 billion in video piracy, right? Brand reputation gets damaged. All of these things have both monetary and brand impacts. In fact, I was just reading a statistic when creating this presentation that out of all the media and entertainment companies that are here, they're experiencing up to 3 cyber attacks yearly. And it happens in all sorts of different ways. Some of this is me just trying to, a hacker trying to get into a network, steal some sort of content like the Game of Thrones example. Some of it is sending you an email that looks real. You click on it, it takes you to what looks like a real website, but what's happened in reality is they've captured some of your username and password. Viruses, you download something from an email or from a website that attacks your computer, and then it attacks other computers once it's kind of gotten yours. So piracy is a problem. It's increasing in size and in frequency, and it impacts brand, and it has a specific monetary value associated with it. So that's why we think it's important to talk about here on this kind of stage. So if you're a cybersecurity practitioner like me, well, what the heck do you do about that? And usually when you're following best practice approaches to that, you generally do that in 3 ways or in 3 areas. One is around detection, second is around prevention, and the third is around mitigation. So what do I mean by that at the highest level? Well, if I want to prevent something, I've got to see it happening, right? I've got to be monitoring for it, looking for it, and then once I find it, or I find that it's happened, I want to prevent it. Without going into a lot of the details of how that happens, those are usually performed by a multitude of different tool sets, and we'll kind of dive into that a little bit. But you can't always even look for it and prevent it. So that Game of Thrones hack I was kind of mentioning earlier where that movie was taken, what the rumor mill suggests is that that attacker was in the HBO network for several months, looking around, fishing around, and then several months later, they took the information. So you could argue that was poorly detected, certainly not prevented. And you can't always prevent it. So even in the case where something is taken, you want to be able to mitigate it. So even if that bad actor took that data, you want to be thinking about mechanisms to encrypt it or to secure it even when it's taken so that it can't be read or transported or distributed or whatever it would be. So these are 3 very general ideas on how, from a security perspective, you want to be thinking about dealing with the piracy problem. So, not that you want to hear from me or anybody else all day, but we could spend all day kind of diving into those details, but just to provide sort of some high-level guidance on what are some best practices in this industry that actually happen in terms of securing content. So the first one is encryption, and I'm certainly going to dive into that because that's a little bit about what my company's doing. But hey, look, that's about the mitigation. That hacker took that Game of Thrones data, right? Because it was unencrypted, they could just throw it out of the internet and everybody can see it. But if it had been encrypted, even if they had taken it, wouldn't have mattered because it would have been unreadable without sort of the ability to unmix up those bits. Digital rights management. We use this every day when we're surfing the Android App Store or the Apple App Store. We're authenticating to ourselves, to Apple's environment, and it's making sure that you or me as a user have access to certain applications. Same should be true for content. Only authorized users and systems have access to certain types of content, right? This happens in TV today, right? We subscribe to DirecTV or to whatever our content distribution mechanism is, and we're authenticating to that to get access to that content. Secure communications. So content is being distributed over the air between vendors for transcoding, ingestion. Make sure that when you are transporting it, it's secure as well so that some bad actor can't listen in. And finally, watermarking. That's where obviously you're adding information to a piece of content in the background or something like that to ensure that the user accessing it is properly identified as well. So just some very high level best practices, and now I'm going to dive into the encryption bit a little bit. And I'm going to do that by talking about a typical media and production workflow. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this at the high level, if not in significant detail, but 2 points I would want to make here are, right, when you're going through content creation, right, you're movie studios creating the content, digitizing it in some way, so there's some sort of ingestion process, and then that gets stored somewhere. But then that gets handed off to some other content management system where it's it's transcoded, maybe there's editing, maybe there's some overlay and tracking, then it gets produced and played out and distributed in some way. And in many cases, there's a lot of different vendors that are applicable in performing each of their function within this kind of value chain, right? There might be 5 or 6 of them to produce one single piece of content. So in every case, they're transporting the content from vendor A to vendor B, to the one transcoding it, to the one editing it. Again, coming back to the idea of the encryption concept, if you encrypt it, but as it goes between these different vendors, it's unreadable if someone's trying to sneak in and grab it, right? Encrypt it when it's stored, right? Pretty standard kind of stuff from a security best practice world. When you're storing it in your S3 bucket or in your Oracle database or whatever, encrypt it there as well. There is a cost to that, obviously, computers, resources, but so if it takes 2 minutes to encrypt an 8 meg file or an 8K file or a movie versus 1 minute, does it really matter? Probably not. The benefit sort of likely outweighs the cost of encryption. So let's talk a little bit about how that would take place. So without getting into too much techie detail, the way encryption works is you're obviously mixing up bits, right, so that they're unreadable. And you usually use what's called a key to do that. Just like all of us have a key to lock and unlock our car, it's specific to us as individuals and specific to the car that we are trying to get into. Same is true in the digital world. You have the idea of keys that uniquely lock or unlock the different bits. So using this diagram here, this is just another way to represent that value chain I was showing with applications in the cloud, right? So if you happen to have some vendor storing your piece of content in S3, you need a key to encrypt and unencrypt that data. And they might be doing transcoding from the same or different vendor. But what if you also have some vendors using Azure that actually are doing the mixing, the electronic programming guide, and distributing it via the Azure ZDN? Well, all of a sudden, I want to be able to use the same key to lock and unlock my bits. But if it's in Amazon, and I throw that key and store it in Amazon, that won't work with the applications in Azure because these are locked in their clouds. Same is true in return, right? If you're in Azure and you're trying to distribute the content via their CDN and you want to encrypt that data or unencrypt it upon distribution, you can't go over to Azure or to Amazon and grab that key. So a common best practice is to encrypt the data within their environments, but store and separate the keys associated with the unlocking and locking of that. So I call that separation of duties, which is really just separating the key from the applications that's managing and hosting and dealing with the content. And you want to do it in a neutral location, right? If I am doing video transcoding in Amazon, I want to make sure that that key is available to the apps in Azure. So you want to be managing, storing, and generating these keys in a neutral place. And you want to do it in a service-based model, just like everything else that's happening in the world. OpEx-based versus CapEx-based, monthly, transaction-oriented instead of buying a whole bunch of stuff up front. So, a little bit of a pitch about my company, kind of got obligatory to do that. So not surprisingly, given all the things I've talked about, my company Equinix solves some of these types of challenges. We offer what we call Smart Key, which is just a product name for what's called a hardware security module as a service, which is really about storing and managing these encryption keys in a neutral location outside of the clouds, but accessible to the clouds, so that they can deliver so we can deliver this key management type of service without having to lock ourselves into those clouds. And so, sorry. So what would that mean? What that would mean specifically would be, it allows you to generate these keys, right? So I can create them, right? To use them, give them to any vendor I want. I can share them with any vendor. I can remove them from access to any vendor as well. And I can make sure that these keys are only accessible by the vendors themselves. Even if a law enforcement agency, if you think back to the North Korean hack example, but that happened in the United States, US government authors a warrant, we wouldn't even have access to that. So the idea of tamper-proofing as secure as possible. So that's kind of it, just a short presentation. Last little pitch about my company is, we do offer this as a trial, try it out, easy to use. So I just want to wrap up by saying, piracy is a concern, whether it's 52 billion or 20 billion or whatever you want to talk about, right? Attacks are happening. They're continuing to happen with increasing size and frequency, and they have a monetary and a brand impact. So from that perspective, just be thinking about security. And when you think about security, think about it from a detection, a prevention, and a mitigation perspective. And then taking that to the next level, whether it's over the air or in storage, think about the benefits of encrypting your data and your content. That's really about it. So, any questions? Okay, thank you.